Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Snow pushed sideways across the Montana foothills, blowing in hard bursts that scraped along the frozen ground and stung Elias Ward's face as he rode the last mile toward his ranch. The late winter air felt sharp in his chest with every breath. His horse moved with a slow, steady gait, hooves sinking into the packed, white crust beneath them. Elias kept one gloved hand tight on the reins and scanned the familiar shapes of his land. The outline of the barn, the fence half buried in drifts, the porch rail leaning slightly where last week's wind had hit it. All of it was exactly as he expected in this season, quiet and plain and cold. But then he saw it, a bundle of torn fabric pressed against the barn wall, right at the corner where the roof overhang offered the smallest break from the wind. At first he thought it was a sack or a broken tarp left behind from autumn repairs. But the shape shifted, only a little. A faint movement in the snow. Elias pulled the reins sharply, and the horse stopped, blowing steam into the air. He felt his stomach tighten and his heartbeat kick harder than he liked. Out here, nothing moved unless it had a reason. He watched the shape for several seconds, the wind lifting loose snow from its surface. Then he climbed down, boots sinking into the drift as he moved closer. The torn blanket was stiff with frost, edges frozen into the ground. When he reached it, he crouched down and saw long dark hair stuck to a pale cheek, the strands frozen together. A woman, young but worn. Her eyes half opened when she sensed someone close, and she shrank back as much as her weak body allowed. Her breath came out in short, uneven bursts. She tried to speak, but the first sound caught in her throat. When she finally whispered, her voice shook with fear rather than cold. "Don't throw me out, please," she said, struggling to lift her head. I'll warm your bed if you let me stay." Elias froze, not from the weather, but from the weight behind those words. They weren't seductive, they were desperate. He saw the raw fear in her eyes, the way she braced herself for anger or disgust. She expected it. She had offered something she didn't want to offer, and he understood immediately that someone had trained her to believe it was the only way to survive. His jaw tightened. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, the kind that came when he saw something he wished he could ignore, but knew he couldn't. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He just steadied his breath and spoke in the low tone he used when calming a frightened horse. "Get up if you can," he said. "You're coming inside." Her eyes widened, not trusting the words. She searched his face for a trap, a demand, anything that matched the offer she'd been forced to make. But he kept his expression plain, serious, and steady. She looked confused by it. She tried to push herself up. Her legs buckled immediately. Elias stepped forward, not grabbing her, but giving her his arm in a way that didn't corner or pressure her. She hesitated again, then rested her fingers against his sleeve, light, shaking, and let him help her stand. Her weight leaned heavily on him. She was colder than she should have been, even for winter. He felt the trembling in her body through the thickness of his coat. Every part of her looked worn down. Her dress ripped at the seams, her shawl torn, her shoes tied together with old twine that had snapped open on one side, leaving one foot almost bare. As they walked toward the house, the wind hit them full force, and she gasped at the cold. Elias tightened his arm around her shoulders, not out of intimacy, but necessity. His mind stayed focused on the next steps: get her inside, warm her, water first, food later. He ran through the tasks the way he did with injured animals or travelers he found stranded on the trail. Practical and controlled, a way to keep his thoughts from slipping into the grief he carried every winter. He pushed open the door and guided her into the dim house where the stove still held a faint glow. The room felt small and plain. Table, chair, narrow bed against the wall, but it was warm enough to slow the shaking in her hands. "Sit," he said, pointing to the floor near the stove where the heat reached strongest. She lowered herself cautiously. Watching him like someone waiting for the moment everything turned dangerous again. Her breathing hitched each time he moved too quickly, so he slowed down, keeping his gestures deliberate. Elias opened the stove and added 2 logs, feeling the heat rise against his face. He filled a tin kettle with water and set it on the top, listening to the faint hiss as the bottom touched the hot metal. He moved around the room, gathering what she'd need: a quilt, a cup, a small loaf of bread, never looking at her long enough to make her uncomfortable, but long enough to make sure she was still conscious. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders, her fingers stiff, and stared into the fire with a hollow look that told him she hadn't truly rested in days. Maybe longer. Only after several minutes did she speak, her voice barely audible. Amara. He nodded once. Elias. She looked up at him, searching for something in his face. He wasn't sure what, but he held her gaze long enough to show he meant no harm. Then he stepped back, giving her space. She relaxed only slightly. As the water heated and the room warmed, Elias felt a quiet shift settle over the house. Not comfort, not familiarity, but the first moment where panic eased and survival stopped being the only thing in the room. He didn't speak more than necessary. She didn't ask questions, but the fear in her eyes softened by a fraction, and Elias knew she wasn't going back out into the cold tonight. And she wouldn't be thrown out tomorrow either. Morning light pushed through the frosted window in thin, uneven streaks, settling on the wooden floor in pale bars that made the small room look colder than it felt. Elias Ward stood near the stove, feeding in a fresh log, the heat brushing against his face while the rest of the cabin stayed chilly. He moved slowly, his shoulders stiff from the cold, and glanced toward the corner where Mara Linnell sat wrapped tightly in the quilt he had given her. She hadn't slept much. He could tell by the way she held her arms around herself, not for warmth now, but for steadiness. Her eyes were clearer than last night, but the fear remained beneath the surface, shifting each time she looked at him. She didn't trust the quiet yet. She didn't trust him either. Not fully. Elias didn't take offense. He understood caution. He lived by it. He turned back to the stove, cracked 2 eggs into a pan, and set a slice of bread near the heat. The simple routine calmed him. He relied on it whenever life pressed too close. Mara watched silently, her fingers tightening around the quilt. She looked ready to flinch at the slightest wrong move. Elias kept his gestures slow and even, careful not to startle her. He wasn't used to having another person in the cabin, and he could feel her presence in every small sound. The shift of fabric, the uneven inhale, the faint scrape of her heel on the floor. When the food was ready, he set a tin plate on the table, then added a cup of warm water beside it. He didn't speak until he stepped back to give her space. It's for you. Her eyes flicked from the plate to his face, uncertain. Hunger and hesitation fought inside her, and it took several seconds before she stood. Her knees wobbled, and she steadied herself on the table before lowering onto the chair. She lifted the fork with both hands, as if worried she'd drop it. Her first bite was small, controlled. The kind of careful eating someone learns after too many days of rationing or too many meals taken in places where one wrong look could cost everything. Elias sat across the room on a wooden crate and checked his saddlebags, pretending not to watch her. But he listened to her breathing, to the sounds of the fork against tin, to the subtle hum of the stove. These small signs told him she was slowly warming, slowly trusting the food in front of her, slowly recognizing she wasn't being asked for anything in return. When she finished, she pushed the plate a few inches forward, unsure what to do next. He nodded toward it. Leave it there. I'll wash it. She blinked, surprised. Most of the tension in her shoulders didn't fade, but something in her expression loosened as she pulled the quilt tighter around herself. Elias stood and pulled on his coat. I'll check the barn. The cold hit him hard when he stepped outside. Fresh snow had gathered against the fence line, and the sky hung low with heavy gray clouds. He worked in silence for nearly an hour, checking feed, clearing drift from the gate, brushing frost from the horses' coats. The work centered him. The rhythm steadied the thoughts that had stirred awake when he found Mara last night. When he returned to the cabin, he saw her sitting near the stove again, the quilt wrapped around her legs, her eyes fixed on the door as if unsure he would come back at all. That look struck him harder than the wind had. It told him she hadn't known safety in a long time. You need anything? He asked. She shook her head quickly, almost too quickly. Her gaze drifted toward the basin of water near the counter. and Elias understood. He poured warm water from the kettle into the basin, then stepped aside. "You can wash up," he said. "I'll step out." Her lips parted in surprise, and he watched her. She wasn't used to someone giving her privacy. She wasn't used to boundaries. He took his coat, but didn't leave until she nodded, showing she understood. When he returned 10 minutes later, her hair was damp from washing, her face scrubbed clean, and her hands trembled less. She stood as if ready to apologize for existing in his space. He lifted a hand slightly, not a command, just a quiet reassurance. "Sit. Rest. Cold's not letting up today." She obeyed, but not out of fear now. Out of exhaustion. The rest of the day passed with careful distance. Mara stayed inside, patching the torn edge of her shawl with a thread she found in his sewing tin. Elias worked outside, repairing a broken board on the fence. Their paths only crossed when he came in for water or when she refilled the wood beside the stove, placing logs neatly the way she had seen him do. When evening settled, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight. Elias set another simple meal on the table, this time without explaining it, and Mara sat as if she had been waiting for a signal. They ate in near silence, their breaths mixing with the quiet crackle of the stove. Mara kept watching him from the corner of her eye, not with suspicion now, but with the cautious interest of someone trying to understand what kind of man she had stumbled into the yard of. After supper, Elias rolled out a spare bedroll for himself near the opposite wall. "You sleep by the stove," he said. "It's warmer." She didn't speak. Her eyes followed every movement he made, as if trying to see whether he expected something from her. But he lay down on his bedroll with his back to her, hands folded on his chest, no closer than necessary. For the first time since he'd found her, Mara relaxed enough to let out a slow exhale. That night, the wind scraped hard against the walls, but inside, the cabin held steady. It was the first quiet shelter either of them had shared in a long time. The snow eased during the night, leaving the ranch covered in a thick white layer that creaked faintly under every step. When Elias stepped outside at dawn, the air felt sharper than the previous day, almost brittle against his skin, and the horizon glowed with a pale blue light that hinted at clearer weather. He closed the door behind him gently, so the sound wouldn't startle Mara. She needed calm. He could see that in every glance she gave the world. He crossed the yard with slow, steady movements, brushing snow from the trough and checking the barn doors for ice buildup. His hands worked out of habit. Years of tending the place alone had turned these chores into muscle memory, and the silence felt familiar, steady, predictable. Inside the cabin, Mara sat up from her quilt, pulling it tighter around her shoulders as she looked around the small room. The warmth from the stove was fading, so she added 2 logs, watching the flames catch slowly. It felt strange to be indoors without someone hovering over her, waiting for her to fail or to owe them something. She listened for Elias's footsteps, unsure whether he'd want her to do anything or whether she should stay out of the way. She stood anyway, moving slowly because her legs were still stiff from the cold and the fear of the last several days. When she opened the door to step outside, Elias was already heading back toward the house. He didn't look surprised to see her awake. "You're up," he said quietly. She nodded, wrapping the quilt around herself like a makeshift coat. "Didn't sleep much. Storm's past for now." He looked at her shoes, still tied together at the seams with fraying twine. "You shouldn't walk far in those." "I'll manage," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. He didn't argue. Instead, he opened the door wider for her to enter first. When she stepped inside, she hesitated for a moment, bothered by the feeling that she should earn the right to walk through a man's door. But Elias didn't demand anything. He didn't even look at her as he brushed snow off his coat and hung it near the stove. Without a word, he took a small hatchet and went back out to split wood. Mara watched him through the window. His movements were slow and deliberate, each swing controlled, the wood splitting cleanly under the blade. He didn't move like someone trying to impress or intimidate. He worked like someone who needed the routine to keep order in his own mind. She understood that feeling. After a few minutes, she stepped outside again, keeping the quilt wrapped around her like armor. She moved to the chicken coop, brushing snow from the roof and gently opening the small door. The hens shifted, restless but safe, and she checked their water and feed the way she had done in her childhood. The familiarity steadied her. Elias looked over once, saw what she was doing, and said nothing. She felt a small sense of relief. No reprimand, no suspicion, just quiet acknowledgement. When she carried a couple of eggs back toward the cabin, he walked past her, hauling an armful of wood. He slowed his pace slightly, matching her steps for a few seconds before continuing ahead. It wasn't a gesture he planned. It just happened. Inside, Mara cracked the eggs into a pan, unsure if she was overstepping. Elias noticed, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stood beside her long enough for her to ask in a small voice, "Is this all right?" "Fine," he said. "Use whatever you need." She nodded and cooked in careful silence. Elias took a seat at the table but didn't watch her, giving her space to move freely in the small kitchen. When she placed the food in front of him, he dipped his head once, a simple thank you that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She wasn't used to gratitude. They ate quietly, the only sounds the scrape of utensils and the low hum of the stove. Mara kept glancing at him, still unsure of the unspoken rules, but noticing details she hadn't before. How he kept his shoulders slightly angled away to give her room. How he never reached across the table suddenly. How his gaze stayed respectful even when he was tired. After breakfast, he started mending a torn strap on his saddle. Mara cleaned the dishes in the basin with warm water, rolling up her sleeves and working with slow, practiced movements. The water steamed around her fingers, making the room feel warmer than it was. Elias glanced over once, saw her working, then returned his focus to the leather strap. By afternoon, a quiet rhythm had formed. Elias worked outside, repairing the fence rail the wind had loosened. Mara swept the porch, collecting small branches scattered from the storm, stacking them neatly beside the woodpile. When she finished, she lingered near the barn door, unsure whether to go inside or wait for Elias. He noticed her standing there, wiped his hands, and called out gently, "If you're cold, fire's still going inside." The tone wasn't dismissive or commanding, just thoughtful. She nodded and stepped back to the cabin, touching the quilt's edge as she went. Later, when she folded one of his shirts that had dried by the stove, she smoothed the fabric with slow, careful strokes. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe to feel useful. Maybe to leave a sign she wasn't trying to take advantage of his kindness. When Elias came in and saw the folded shirt, he paused. She stiffened immediately, expecting a correction or a warning. Instead, he picked up the shirt, nodded once without expression, and put it away. The moment lasted only a second, but something inside her loosened. She felt the smallest shift, like the first warm breath inside a freezing room. Their routines had begun to overlap, not from obligation, but from the quiet understanding that two people could share space without hurting each other. And for Mara, that was something she hadn't felt in years. Night settled heavily over the foothills, leaving the ranch wrapped in a quiet that felt too large for the small cabin. The wind had calmed, but the cold pressed against the windows with a steady persistence. And inside, the dim lamplight flickered across the walls as Mara tried to sleep near the stove. She lay curled under the quilt, her breathing shallow, her eyes open more often than shut. Every small sound, Elias shifting on his bedroll, the wood popping inside the stove, the faint whistle of wind along the roof, pulled her back into alertness. Her muscles tightened before she even realized she was reacting. It took Elias only a glance to understand she was fighting sleep, not from discomfort, but from fear. He had seen men and women come through town with the same look, wide eyes, quick breaths, hands ready to defend even when no threat was near. He sat at the table sharpening a tool, the rasp of metal against metal slow and even. He made sure not to move too suddenly or scrape the blade too loudly. He had learned long ago how noise could feel like danger. When Mara finally drifted off, her rest didn't last. A few minutes passed before her body jerked awake, eyes wide, breath hitching as if someone had shook her from a deep nightmare. The quilt slipped from her shoulders, and her fingers dug into the floorboards as though bracing for impact. Elias stopped sharpening immediately, keeping the knife still in his hand, not rising or approaching. He spoke without turning his head, keeping his tone steady. "You're inside. Nothing's happening." She blinked rapidly, trying to orient herself. Her chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, her gaze darting around the dim room as if searching for the door, for a threat, for anything that explained why her heart was pounding. When she realized where she was, her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but confusion and then embarrassment. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders and sat with her back against the stove, staring at the floor. "Sorry," she whispered, voice thin. Elias placed the knife on the table, pushing it away from him deliberately so she wouldn't worry. "No need." She nodded, though she didn't seem to believe him. Her hands trembled slightly, and she tucked them under the quilt to hide it. For a moment, neither spoke. The room settled into a steady quiet again, broken only by the low crackle of firewood. After a long while, she murmured, "I'm not used to sleeping safe." Elias understood more than he let show. He had spent years waking from dreams where he heard his wife calling his name from a place he couldn't reach. The first winter after losing her had been the hardest. Long nights, restless sleep, the constant sense of something missing in the silence. "You will be," he said, keeping his eyes on the stove to give her space. She looked up, studying his profile in the low light. His expression didn't shift much, but his voice carried something that didn't come out often: certainty. Mara drew the quilt closer and exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing a little, though not completely. She hesitated before speaking again. "You live alone a long time?" He nodded. "Years." "Why?" she asked quietly, testing the air, as if prepared for him to shut down the question. Elias paused, jaw tightening. The answer rose in him like something pulled from beneath cold water, heavy and old. He didn't want to talk about his wife. Not because he didn't trust Mara, but because the memory sat deep in him, guarded like a wound that had never fully closed. "Someone I loved died," he said simply. After that, being alone felt easier. Mara lowered her gaze, absorbing the weight behind those words. She didn't pry further. She understood grief well enough to recognize when someone carried it quietly. Outside, wind scraped along the side of the cabin again. She tensed at the noise, but this time her reaction softened when she saw Elias watching the window with calm attention, not fear. That steadiness helped her breathe easier. Later, when Elias prepared his bedroll again, Mara whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." He paused before lying down, his hand resting on the blanket. He didn't give some grand reassurance or comforting speech. That wasn't his way. "You needed shelter," he said. "That's reason enough." She swallowed hard, feeling emotions she hadn't allowed herself in years. Relief mixed with confusion, trust mixed with fear of losing it. Elias laid down, facing the ceiling, hands folded across his chest, eyes open in the dim light. Mara shifted closer to the stove, her breathing finally leveling out. For the rest of the night, silence filled the cabin. But it wasn't the cold, sharp silence that had followed her for months. Instead, it held the faint strain of two people learning to inhabit the same space without crowding each other, their separate burdens resting side by side. And for the first time since arriving at his barn wall half frozen, Mara's eyes stayed closed long enough for real sleep to begin. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted into a heavy, steel-gray sheet stretching from one ridge of the foothills to the other, the kind of sky that warned anyone who'd lived through a Montana winter that a hard storm was coming. Elias stepped onto the porch, pulling his coat tighter as he tested the wind with a long, steady look. He didn't like the temperature or the way the clouds were building low and fast. The air felt dense, ready to break. Inside the cabin, Mara was sorting firewood near the stove. When she noticed him staring out across the yard, she straightened and watched him with a careful expression. She could sense tension even before he spoke. "Storm's rolling in quick," he said quietly. "How bad?" she asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. He judged weather the way some men judged poker hands, silently, precisely, relying on instinct built from years of watching skies turn without warning. "Bad enough we need everything tight before nightfall." Mara grabbed her shawl, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her hands were thin but steady. She didn't ask for instructions. She simply waited for him to move, reading his worry as clearly as footprints in fresh snow. They stepped outside together. The cold hit harder than earlier, pushing sideways across the yard with a biting force that stung skin through layers of fabric. Snow began drifting in light sheets, blowing low across the ground like dust carried by wind. Elias walked toward the barn with long, controlled strides. Mara followed, her feet slipping once on a patch of ice before she caught herself. He glanced back only briefly, making sure she hadn't fallen, before continuing. He wasn't a man who panicked, but the pressure in his chest grew in a slow, familiar way whenever danger threatened the ranch. He had lost too much in his life to take chances now. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and warm animals. The horses stirred uneasily, picking up on the change in the weather. Elias moved straight to the stall doors to check their latches. Mara stood nearby, waiting for something she could do. She didn't like being idle when there was trouble brewing. "What can I help with?" she asked. He nodded toward a stack of hay. "Bring a bale over. We'll lay it against the draft on the east wall." She nodded quickly and went to grab it, dragging the bale across the floor with a quiet grunt. It was heavier than it looked, but the strain didn't bother her. Working felt better than standing still. As they secured the hay and tightened ropes along the gate, the wind outside began to howl, blowing sharp gusts against the barn walls. The boards shuddered with each blast. Mara flinched at the sound, but Elias barely reacted. Storms had tested these walls many times, though never with her inside them. "We need to check the feed barrels," he said. They worked fast, lifting lids, brushing off snow that had blown inside, tightening any loose covers. Elias moved with practiced efficiency, his thoughts racing ahead of his hands. Mara matched his pace as best she could. Each time he passed her a tool, she took it without hesitation. Each time she finished a task, she looked to him for the next one. The storm intensified quickly. Snow began swirling harder, tapping against the barn roof in uneven rhythms. A gust slammed against the open barn door, nearly tearing it from Mara's grip. She gasped as the wind pushed her backward. Elias reached her in 2 long strides and grabbed the door beside her, bracing it with his shoulder. "Hold it with both hands," he said over the wind. She did, gripping the edge tightly until her knuckles turned white. Together, they forced the door shut. The latch clicked into place just as a new blast of wind struck the wall, rattling the boards. Breathing hard, Mara pressed her back against the door. Elias saw the tremor in her hands, not from cold, but from the surge of fear. He recognized it. Storms could rip roofs off in seconds. For someone who lived close to danger, anything sudden could feel like a threat. "You did fine," he said low and steady. Mara nodded, trying to steady her breath. She hadn't heard reassurance, spoken without expectation in a long time. They gathered the lantern and hurried back to the cabin through wind that felt like needles against their faces. The snow had thickened so much that the house looked blurred through the white curtain, even though it was only a dozen yards away. Mara stumbled once. Elias caught her elbow without breaking stride. Inside, they shut the door against the storm's force. The windows rattled violently, as if something struck them from outside. Mara stood near the table, soaked in snow, her breath shallow. Elias hung his coat, then crossed the room to the stove and moved quickly to build a stronger fire. The heat grew gradually, pushing back the chill in the air. Mara moved closer, warming her hands. Her shoulders still shook from the cold and adrenaline. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice didn't follow right away. After a moment, she said, "I haven't worked in storms like this not for a long time." He added another log to the fire. "You handled yourself fine. Helping made it easier." Mara looked at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. No one had ever told her she made anything easier. They sat near the stove as the storm battered the house. The constant sound of wind against the walls made Mara's breath tighten. But each time she looked at Elias, calm, grounded, watching the fire with quiet focus, her fear settled slightly. After a long while, she said softly, "You didn't have to go out there with me." He looked at her, his expression unreadable but gentle in its own restrained way. Couldn't leave the place to fight it alone. And I wasn't letting you face it by yourself. Her eyes softened, the tension around them easing. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders, letting the warmth sink in. The storm kept pushing against the cabin, but for the first time, she didn't feel like the wind could blow her away. Here, in this small house with a man who spoke little but acted with steady purpose, she felt something unfamiliar but steady growing inside her. A quiet sense that she was no longer a burden or a stray crossing someone's path. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone had chosen to keep her safe. The storm buried the ranch in white the next morning. Snow packed against the cabin walls almost to the windowsill, and the air outside was so still that sound seemed to vanish beneath it. Inside, the stove crackled with a low, steady flame that pushed warmth into the small room, and Mara stood near holding her palms out, her fingers still stiff from yesterday's cold. Elias stepped into his boots with deliberate movements. His shoulders were tense, the kind of tension that came from responsibility rather than fear. He glanced at the window once, judging the weight of the snow, then began pulling on his coat. "I'm checking the barn," he said. Mara tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "I'll go with you." He hesitated, not because he doubted her, but because he weighed the risk of the cold against the steadiness she'd shown the night before. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close." They stepped outside together. The cold hit immediately, colder than the day before, quieter too. Snow crunched under their boots with a heavy sound, and Mara took slow steps to keep her balance. Elias kept his pace even, not walking ahead too far, aware of her every movement without staring. Inside the barn, the air felt warmer and filled with the steady sound of horses shifting in their stalls. The animals were restless but unharmed, and Elias checked each latch with the same patience he used for everything. Mara moved beside him, brushing snow off the feed barrels and lifting a small shovel to clear the walkway. She didn't wait to be told. She just worked. He noticed. They finished in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence shaped by shared effort, the kind that had formed naturally over the past days. When they walked back to the cabin, the wind skimmed across the snow in soft waves, and Mara's steps slowed, her breath catching. Elias turned toward her. "Cold getting to you?" "A little," she admitted. He didn't comment. He simply shifted closer so the wind hit his side instead of hers. The gesture was small, but she felt it immediately. Someone shielding her from the wind had not happened in years. Inside the cabin again, warmth wrapped around them. Elias set his gloves near the stove to dry, and Mara hung her shawl on the chair. Their breaths were still heavy, their cheeks red from the cold. Mara rubbed her hands together and watched him from the corner of her eye. "You always work like that?" she asked quietly. "Non-stop." He shrugged. "Things fall apart fast out here if you don't stay ahead of them." She studied him for a moment. There was something in the way he said it, an edge of memory, not bitterness but resignation. He had lived too long with loss, enough to turn routine into armor. "I'm not trying to make more work for you," she said. "You're not." His voice was firm, simple, final. "You've helped." The words lingered in the warm air. Being told she helped, rather than hindered, hit her harder than she expected. Her throat tightened, and she lowered her gaze quickly. Elias reached for a loose floorboard near the table, tapping it with his knuckles. "This has been rattling for weeks," he said, changing the subject in the only way he knew, practical, grounded, avoiding emotional weight until he had the strength for it. She kneeled beside him. "What do you need me to do?" He handed her a small jar of nails and pointed. She held the board steady as he hammered, the sound echoing through the small cabin. Their hands were close but never touched, though the distance between them felt narrower than it had a day ago. When the board finally sat flush, Elias tested it with his boot. "That's better." Mara watched him stand, noticing the quiet pride in his work and the faint softness in his expression when he glanced at her. She returned the nails to the jar, then caught him looking at her shoes, the same torn, useless things tied together with worn twine. "You won't make it through another storm in those," he said. "I know," she replied, heat rising to her cheeks. "I didn't have much time to grab things when I left." The unspoken story hung between them. She waited for him to ask questions, to pry into her past like men always had. He didn't. Instead, he walked to a small trunk near the wall. He opened it and pulled out an old pair of wool socks and a pair of his softest boot liners, worn but intact. "Try these," he said, setting them on the table. "Won't fix the shoes, but you'll be warmer." Her breath thinned as she stared at the items. No one had offered her something simply because she needed it, not without expecting something in return. "I'll take care of them," she whispered. "They're meant to be used," he said. "You need them more than I do." She swallowed hard and nodded, unable to find more words. Later, as evening settled and the light dimmed into a soft orange around the stove, Mara moved toward her sleeping spot. She paused at the doorway, looking back at Elias as he sorted through tools on the table. "You've done more for me than anyone has in a long time," she said quietly. He didn't turn fully, but his hands stilled. "You're safe here." Her breath caught at the certainty in his tone. She stepped into her corner of the room and settled onto the quilt, feeling warmth. Not just from the stove, but from something steadier, something she hadn't let herself rely on in years. Elias lay down on his bedroll moments later. He didn't look at her, but his voice carried through the dim. "Get some rest. Weather's easing. Tomorrow will be easier." For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mara believed him. The storm broke during the night. By morning, the land lay under a thick blanket of white that shone faintly in the early light, and the wind had finally gone quiet. The world felt still in a way that made every sound inside the cabin, every shift of wood in the stove, every creak of the floor, carry further than usual. Mara awoke slowly, blinking against the dim light coming through the window. Her body ached from the previous day's work, but the heaviness in her chest felt smaller. She sat up and pulled the quilt around her, noticing that the air inside the cabin held a faint warmth rather than the sharp bite she'd first encountered days ago. Elias was already up. He sat at the table, lacing his boots with steady, practiced movements. His hair was still damp from washing, and the sleeves of his wool shirt were rolled halfway up his forearms. His expression was the same quiet calm she had grown used to, but there was something different in his eyes now, something softer that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "Storm's gone," he said without looking up. Mara nodded, stretching her fingers under the quilt. "Feels different. We'll need to check the pasture," he added, standing and testing the tightness of his left boot. Fences might have shifted. The shed, too. She felt a nervous pull in her stomach, not from the work ahead, but from a thought she'd been carrying since before dawn, one she'd pushed away each time it tried to take shape. When he stepped outside to gather tools, she stood at the window and watched him move across the yard. His gait was strong, steady despite the deep snow. She took in the quiet precision of his actions, how he lifted the latch with care, how he tested the gate's hinge before opening it fully. Something about watching him work made her chest tighten, not with fear, with a strange sense of belonging she had never expected to feel again. She pulled on the extra socks he had given her and tightened her shoes as best she could. The warmth against her feet lingered from yesterday. When Elias returned for his gloves, he paused when he saw her dressed. "You coming?" he asked. "If you want the help." He turned toward the door again. "Come on then." Outside, the snow reached nearly to her calves. The air was crisp, clean, and heavy with the smell of pine and cold earth beneath the frost. Mara stepped carefully, warming her hands in the sleeves of her shawl. Elias slowed his pace just slightly, so she could keep up, though he didn't mention it. They reached the fence line first. Some posts leaned from the weight of the snow, but most stood firm. Elias pressed his palm against one and pushed gently. "This one'll hold," he murmured. "Let's check the far side." Mara followed him around the pasture. The landscape stretched wide and white. The mountains in the distance etched sharply against the cold sky. The quiet felt deeper than before, less like loneliness, more like a pause after something difficult. When they reached the back of the shed, Elias crouched to inspect a loose plank. Mara knelt beside him, brushing away snow with her bare hand. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I'm used to cold," she answered, though the sting in her fingers betrayed her. He frowned slightly, then reached into his coat and pulled out a spare glove. He handed it to her without looking at her face, as if the gesture meant nothing. But it meant everything. She slid it on quietly. They worked for nearly an hour, repairing what they could and clearing snow from the areas that needed it. Their movements grew more familiar, more coordinated, until neither had to speak to know what the other intended. When they finally returned to the yard, Mara's breath came out in exhausted clouds. Elias studied her for a moment, noticing the strain in her posture. "You're freezing," he said. "Go warm up. I'll finish the water trough." She shook her head. "I can help." "Go on," he said again, softer this time. His voice had changed, still quiet, still restrained, but gentler. Inside the cabin, she stood near the stove, letting heat crawl into her bones. She stared at the door, waiting for the question she had been avoiding to catch up with her. What happens when the weather clears for good? When Elias finally stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, Mara turned to him with an expression he caught immediately. Uncertain, conflicted, bracing for something. He took off his gloves and hung them near the stove. He didn't rush her or press her to speak. He just waited, arms resting loosely at his sides, the lamplight catching the faint tiredness in his eyes. "When the cold lifts more," she said slowly, "I could go. I don't want to bring trouble here." Elias stilled. Not dramatically, not with shock. He just stopped moving entirely, his hand hovering over the back of a chair. Seconds passed without either of them breathing much. She continued quietly, "You've done enough. More than enough. Once things ease up, I won't be a burden." Elias lowered his hand to the chair, but didn't sit. His face stayed calm, but something behind it shifted in a way she couldn't name. "You're not a burden," he said simply. She swallowed, surprised by how much those words tightened her throat. Her voice came out in a small whisper. "Still, maybe I shouldn't stay." He didn't look away from her. His jaw worked once, a subtle tightening that betrayed more than any speech could have. "You don't have to go," he said, quiet but firm. "If you don't want to." The room seemed to hold still around them. Mara felt something warm and frightening rise in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Because it meant wanting something. It meant not running. It meant choosing to stay. She lowered her gaze, unable to look at him any longer, afraid he would see too much. Outside, the last of the storm's breath settled over the snow, and inside the cabin, a new understanding began shaping itself, slow, fragile, and steady. Neither of them reached for it yet, but both felt it. The next morning carried a faint hint of warmth, the kind that didn't melt snow yet, but promised the sky was beginning to loosen its grip on winter. A thin line of sunlight touched the porch rail, and the quiet outside felt less harsh, more expectant. Mara stood at the window, watching the soft steam curl from the animal's breath in the distance. The land looked peaceful in a way she hadn't let herself feel in years. Behind her, Elias moved through the cabin with the same steady rhythm she had grown used to. He set 2 tin plates on the table without thinking about it, a habit he hadn't had before she arrived. Mara watched the simple action, her chest tightening in a way she didn't know how to explain. It wasn't what he did. It was the familiarity of it, the expectation of her presence. When he looked up and saw her watching, he paused for barely a second before clearing his throat and returning to his movements, slow, practical, careful. "Breakfast is ready," he said. She sat across from him, her hands still cold around the tin cup of coffee. Elias ate quietly, each motion deliberate, the scrape of utensils steady and grounded. Mara studied the way his shoulders no longer seemed as tense as they were days ago, how his eyes held fewer shadows when they met hers. After a few minutes, she said, "You don't have to make food for me every morning." He shrugged lightly. "Doesn't take much more. Besides, 2 plates make sense now." Her breath caught slightly. He had said it so plainly, so naturally, as if her presence had already woven itself into his routines without him noticing. When they finished, Elias reached for his coat and tools. "Fence line's holding, but we should fix a few boards before the thaw." "We," she echoed gently. He glanced back at her, the corner of his mouth tightening, not into a smile, exactly, but into something that softened his expression. "If you're feeling strong enough," he said, "I'd welcome the help." She nodded, warmth spreading through her chest. I want to. They stepped outside together. The air carried a faint dampness from melting snow, and Mara felt her steps growing more confident as they walked toward the fence. Elias handed her the nail bucket while he carried the hammer. Their movements aligned with an ease that surprised them both. They worked side by side for most of the morning. He held the board in place. She steadied the nails. When her hands trembled slightly from cold, he saw it and shifted closer, blocking the wind without needing to speak. When he dropped a nail into the snow, she knelt quickly and plucked it out before he could bend down, offering it quietly. By midday, they had repaired 3 boards. Elias wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, glancing over at her with a careful, lingering look. "You work steady," he said. Mara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from exertion, but from the simple respect in his tone. "You don't slow down either." He grunted softly, almost amused. "Habit. Hard to break." She looked down at her hands, the glove he'd given her yesterday, smudged with dirt. "Thank you for letting me help." He paused long enough for her to notice. "I'm not letting you. You're choosing to. That's different." The words hit deeper than he intended. She looked away quickly, overwhelmed by the weight they carried. She had not been given choices in a long time. When they finished the repairs and walked back to the cabin, Mara's steps slowed near the porch. Something sat heavy in her chest. Fear, gratitude, and the quiet ache of wanting something she wasn't sure she could have. Inside, the warmth of the stove filled the room. Elias removed his coat and hung it neatly on the hook. Mara hovered near the table, not sitting, not speaking. He noticed her stillness. "What's wrong?" he asked. She took a slow breath. "I've been thinking about what I said yesterday. About leaving." Elias's posture changed immediately, subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared. His breath stopped for a beat. He kept his hands by his sides, as if afraid any motion might make her withdraw farther. "You still thinking that?" he asked. She looked down at the floor. "I don't know. I'm not used to staying anywhere, or being wanted anywhere." A beat of silence. Elias stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough that she felt his presence steady and grounded beside her. "You're not trouble," he said quietly. "You're not a burden, and you don't have to earn a place here." Her voice broke slightly. "Then why would you want me to stay?" He took his time answering, his eyes lowered to the floorboards as if the truth needed grounding before he spoke it. "This house has been empty too long," he said finally. "Quiet can be good, but there's a kind that feels hollow." He lifted his gaze to meet hers. "It hasn't felt hollow with you here." Her breath trembled. Her fingers curled into her shawl. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Plain, honest, without expectation. After a long moment, she whispered, "I don't want to run anymore." Elias inhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing in a way he hadn't expected. "Then don't." A quiet settled between them, warm, steady, and full of possibilities they weren't ready to name out loud. Mara stepped closer, drawn by something she had fought against for years. Safety. The stove crackled. The walls held still. And in the small, simple room, the choice she feared became the choice she embraced. She was staying. Not because she owed him anything. Not because she had nowhere else. But because for the first time in years, she wanted to. The last traces of winter melted slowly over the next week, leaving the land damp and raw, but full of the first hints of spring. The snow thinned across the pasture, gathering in uneven patches that glistened under the rising sun. Cold wind still came through in short bursts, but it no longer carried the sharp edge of survival. Instead, it felt like the land was taking a long breath after months of holding itself tight. Inside the cabin, the air held a warmth that was different from the stove's heat. Elias moved through the room with a steadiness that had shifted in small, noticeable ways. He reached for 2 cups instead of 1 without thinking. He paused when Mara passed behind him, letting her move freely in the small space. He watched her work with a quiet awareness he did not try to hide anymore. Mara, too, had changed. She no longer hovered near the doorway or flinched at sudden noises. Her steps were sure, her hands steady as she rinsed tin plates in warm water. Her eyes no longer darted to the corners of the room, checking for escape. She moved as someone who had begun to believe in safety again, piece by piece. That morning, after finishing chores, they stood outside near the porch. The sky stretched wide above them, no longer heavy with snow, and the fields opened in long, soft lines toward the hills. Mara took in a slow breath, feeling the air fill her lungs in a way that didn't hurt. Elias stood beside her, hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression calm but thoughtful. He broke the quiet first. "We've made it through the worst of the season," he said. "Spring's coming fast." Mara nodded. "I can feel it. You've been working strong," he added. "Barn's in better shape than it's been in months." She looked down, a small smile forming. Praise still felt unfamiliar, but she didn't shy away from it anymore. It's easier when someone shows you how to do things right. Elias shifted his weight, glancing toward the pasture where the horses moved slowly through the thinning snow. For a long moment, he said nothing. Mara sensed something heavy behind his silence. Not fear, not hesitation, but the weight of a decision he had turned over in his mind more than once. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steadier than before, controlled but open. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the house, about us sharing it." Mara's heart tightened as she faced him. His eyes held the same calm blue they always did, but there was a softness there that hadn't been present the day she arrived. "You don't owe me anything," he continued. "But if you want a place here, if you want to stay, not because of cold or fear or lack of options, but because it feels right, I'd like that." She swallowed several times before she trusted her voice. "You're sure?" He nodded once. "I'm sure." Mara felt a warmth rise from her chest to her throat, stronger than any fire in the stove. She had been waiting for someone to take something from her, waiting for a demand, waiting for the moment his kindness turned into death. But it hadn't. Not once. "I want to stay," she said, voice steady. "Not because I need shelter anymore, because I feel safe. And I haven't felt that in a long time." Elias exhaled slowly, a faint release of tension he hadn't realized he carried. He stepped closer, close enough for warmth to pass between them, but not close enough to overwhelm. His hand hovered for a moment before he let it rest gently on her forearm. Mara didn't flinch. Instead, she breathed out shakily and leaned into the touch. They stood that way for several seconds. Two people who had survived separate storms, now finding stillness in the same place. When Elias finally spoke again, his tone held a quiet certainty she had grown to trust. "We take this slow," he said. "As slow as you need." She nodded. "As slow as we need." His expression softened, enough for a faint, restrained smile to appear. It wasn't big, but it was real. Mara reached for his hand, hesitant at first, then firmer when he didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had been reaching across the cold toward each other since the first night. Together, they walked across the yard, side by side, toward the pasture that stretched warm and wide under the soft light of early spring. There were no dark corners left in her mind telling her to run, and no shadows in his eyes reminding him of the emptiness he used to call routine. For the first time in years, both felt a future taking shape not from desperation, but from choice. And when they reached the fence line, Elias stopped and looked at the land ahead, then at Mara beside him, a woman who had arrived half frozen and terrified, and who now stood steady and alive under his roof. "Home feels different now," he said. Mara squeezed his hand. "It feels like ours." The wind moved through the clearing gently, carrying no threat, only the promise of a new season. Elias lifted her hand slightly, holding it with a quiet certainty that needed no words. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, no longer two strangers sharing space, but two people building a life side by side, the winter behind them and a steady, chosen peace ahead.